Now we're into the second main topic of the course, and that is the nature of rationality. And there is a standard conception of rationality. It's in decision theory. It's in any economics textbook. Probably the best statement of it is in that article assigned in the Reader by Gary Becker. I don't know what's it called, Economic Approach to Behavior or something like that. And there it is a classical statement of rationality. And I told you some difficulties with that, just prima facie difficulties. One is that if I value 25 cents and I value my life, there must be some odds at which I'd bet my life against 25 cents. And I want to say there aren't any odds at which I'd make that bet. If there were, I wouldn't bet my child's life against 25 cents. And the answer that somebody mentioned last time to that that's given to me is, well, you'll do things that are equivalent to that, and whenever you drive to the airport or pick up 25 cents off the street. Now, I want to show that's a bad argument, but to do that, we have to say more about intentionality. So we'll come to that. Another difficulty with a classical analysis is that on the classical analysis, it's irrational to vote for reasons that I said the other day. But there are other things that are absurd consequences of the classical analysis. Here's another one. I go to the San Francisco Opera. It often happens that on the day of the opera, I think, oh, God, I don't want to drive all the way to San Francisco. And then I think how much I paid for the ticket. God, well, and then that gives me an extra reason for going. Now, on the classical model of rationality, that's no reason for going to the opera at all. Those are what's called sunk costs. So on the classical analysis, there are two different scenarios. One is when you're given a free ticket, and on the day of going, you just don't feel like going, so you don't use the free ticket. Another, same opera, same ticket, only this time you paid $300 for the ticket, and you think, well, that's a lot of money, I better go. Now, on the classical analysis, you're being irrational. You have exactly the same reason for going with a free ticket as you do with the expensive ticket. I think that's another absurd result, and I need to say why that's an absurd result. I mean, Bob Nozick put it very well. He said, suppose you could take a pill that prevented this form of irrationality, that prevented you from reasoning about how you should consider money you've already spent in making your decisions. And would you take the pill? And the answer is no, I wouldn't take the pill. I think there's nothing wrong with reasoning. But the technical name for that is, well, that's a sunk cost. You've already spent that money. Becker is a guy who thinks when you get married, essentially, calculate utilities. Don't ask yourself such dumb questions as, do you love this person? Because who the hell knows what the marginal utility of that is? The thing to do is calculate utilities. I've often wondered what those guys would say about rationality in a country like Mexico. I think the rational thing to do is accept bribes. And I don't see how they could avoid that argument. And indeed, accept bribes anywhere if you have good reason to suppose you can get away with it. It's just calculating probabilities like any other. Okay, we're going to come back to that. But now I'm going step by step through the 6 propositions that I figured were essential to the classical model. And the first was that actions are caused by beliefs and desires. That is, rational actions, where rational, are caused, and sometimes they say in the right way. They're caused in the right way by the beliefs and desires. Now I want to say, if causation here means causally sufficient conditions, then in general, only irrational actions have beliefs and desires as causally sufficient conditions. Those are the case where you're in the grip of an obsession, or you're in the grip of a lust, and you simply can't help yourself. Those are the cases where your action is caused by your beliefs and desires, but they're hardly, compulsive behavior is hardly the model of rationality. It happens to us, but it's not what I would think of as the right way to think of rationality. Well, what's wrong with it? Well, in real life, you have this experience that I call the experience of the gap. You have a sense of possible options open to you. And the name for that gap, to repeat, is freedom of the will. Now, the fact that you have these experiences don't show that you really have free will. The whole thing might be a colossal illusion. Evolution might have played an enormous practical joke on us by giving us the conviction, the experience of free will, when it's all an illusion. All of our behavior is completely determined. It was written in the book of history 13 billion years ago that at this particular moment, in this particular spot, Searle's left hand would go out and scratch the top of his remaining head. Okay. Now, that's the picture. It's an elegant picture, and indeed a lot of philosophers have thought, well, you can't help that picture. You couldn't think without that picture. Kant said we couldn't reason about reality unless we presupposed total determinism. Now, he also cheated on the side, as is typical. He said, of course, there's another world, the world of the noumenal, and in that world, you're free. Okay, but it's in this world where I live. I've never been to noumenal. You know, I think it must be somewhere in Kansas, but on the West Coast, it's all phenomenal. And on the phenomenal world, according to Kant, everything is determined. And indeed, if it wasn't determined, we wouldn't be able to make sense of it. It would be unintelligible to us. Now, you might think, well, that's an extreme view, but something very like it is advanced by philosophers that we all know and respect. And I'm thinking of Tom Nagel and Galen Strawson, and they argue as follows. Suppose determinism wasn't true. Suppose you really did have free will. Then if you're asked, why did you do something, and you gave a non-determinist answer, you wouldn't explain it. You say, somebody said, why did you vote for Obama? And you give your reasons for voting for Obama. Now, suppose determinism wasn't true, then says Nagel, the explanation of the action would not explain the action, because an explanation has to explain why the thing that occurred as opposed to something else that might have occurred. But if the explanation you give is non-deterministic, then it's consistent with all sorts of other things occurring. You might have voted for the other guy, you might not have voted for all, so you would not have succeeded in explaining anything. Does everybody follow this? That is, unless the story goes, and this is advanced both by Strawson, that's Galen, Peter, by Strawson and by Tom Nagel, unless the explanation of human behavior is deterministic, it wouldn't explain. It would not answer the question we're trying to answer, namely, why did you do it? Okay, I resist the temptation to answer all of these points right now, but these are promises that I'm making to you. We have to answer these points. We have to answer the claim that says that an explanation, a non-deterministic explanation, would simply fail to explain, because an explanation has to say why the thing that happened as opposed to something else that could have happened. And if it doesn't answer that question, then it doesn't explain. Jennifer.
Why such constraints on social explanation? Why does it have to be necessarily the case?
Well, the story in Nagel, and I think in Strawson as well, goes as follows. What do you want from an explanation? Suppose I knock this hat and it falls to the ground. And I want an explanation of why it fell to the ground. I say, it was acted on by the force of gravity, and there were no other interfering forces. That being the case, it had to fall to the ground. The explanation gives sufficient conditions. Given that setup, nothing else could have happened. It had to fall to the ground. But now, when I explain why I voted for Obama, then it looks like, unless determinism is true, I don't satisfy that condition. Because at the end of the story, somebody says, well, okay, you thought he'd be better for the economy, and you thought it wouldn't matter for foreign policy. The Republicans and the Democrats were going to have effectively the same foreign policy. Obama might do it with better public relations, which is what in fact happened. But the policy in Iraq and Afghanistan is pretty much identical under both Obama and Bush, and would have been the same under McCain. So it has to be something domestic. And if somebody then says to me, okay, that's why you voted for Obama, but you mean, given all that, you had to vote for him? No, I could have voted for the other guy. In fact, there were moments when I thought, God, if all these politically correct people think Obama's okay, there must be something terribly wrong with him that I'm not seeing, you know. But in any case, I give an explanation. And according to Nagel and other philosophers whom I respect, like Galen Strawson, if the explanation wasn't deterministic, it wouldn't explain. It wouldn't explain why I did what I did as opposed to something else I might have done. It's not enough to say, well, there was this reason in favor of doing it. You've got to give an explanation that says, this is what had to happen. This is, given the way things were set up, just like this is what had to happen. Now, why do we know that Nagel's wrong? We know that he's wrong because in our own case, I know why I did something. I know that the explanation, I know without observation that the explanation is valid. I know that's the reason I acted on. Of course, it might be self-deception or all kinds of other cases, but leaving them out, leaving aside various forms of psychological aberrations, I know why I did what I did, even though the answer that I give to the question, why did you do it, is not a deterministic answer. Now, how can that be the case? How can it be the case that I can give reasons for action, which are valid reasons, and they're not deterministic? And if somebody said, well, how do you know they're valid? And the answer is they're valid for me. I can tell you how my reasoning process went and what reason I acted on. Now, of course, there's always self-deception, pathologies of various the various kinds of psychotic behavior, but we're leaving them out. We're assuming this is not a case for a psychoanalyst. It's a case for a philosopher analyzing rational decision-making. Okay, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm going to come back to these issues later. Other questions at this point? Because yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like, why did you vote for Obama? Why didn't you vote for McCain? And like so.
Yeah, okay. Well, another story goes as follows. We ought to think of decision-making as like a vector of forces in a matrix. And I don't know if you ever had to do these questions in high school physics. I did, where you got a force operating that way and another force operating this way, and this force a bit stronger than that force, so you wind up going that way or something like that. Why isn't it like that? Well, the answer is it isn't like that. There's no way I can vote for a guy in the middle, right? If this one over here is Obama and this is McCain, I can't think, well, I got these forces working that way and that force that way, so I'll calculate and vote for this guy in the middle. There was no guy in the middle. You have to, well, there may have been other third-party candidates, but I don't remember even who they were. I didn't take them seriously at the time. But you're right, though, that all of these things, on the account that I've been giving you, exist within a network and exist against a background of possibilities. And it's only given the network and the background that I can make rational decisions at all, that I can have any intentionality. Yes?
For the example that you just gave, what if, like, I think it could kind of work if you had, like kind of like an action potential, like a threshold. Like, maybe you're getting these two different influences, and once, like, one influence gets to a certain level, it goes all the way, and you go all the way to Obama.
Yeah.
Or somewhere in the middle to begin with. Like,
Well, that's right. I mean, I think you're right there that you have all these influences operating on you. But here's what's remarkable. I want you to always pay close attention to how we describe these things in ordinary language. I had various reasons for voting for Obama, various reasons for voting for the other guy, various reasons voting for and against, but all the same, this is why I voted the way I did. Now watch this. I made this reason effective. There are all these other reasons, but they weren't effective. I made this reason effective by acting on this reason. There was a guy who was the president of the United States once, and I voted for him when he got elected. But then he came up another time, and it turned out he had done something in college. He went to the same university I did, and he did something that I regard as absolutely outrageous. When he was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, absolutely unforgivable. So I did not vote against Bill Clinton the second time around. Why? He didn't take his exams. You have to take the damn exams. Now, I admit, I'm probably the only guy in the whole country that voted against Clinton on the grounds that he never took schools. The rest of us dressed up in these dumb outfits. You look like a penguin. The girls have to wear all black so we will not be distracted. Even their stockings have to be black. The guys dress in dark suits with a white bow tie and a black gown, and everybody sits at a separate desk that's got your name printed on it, for God's sake. The whole thing is scary, and you have to take the exam. Clinton didn't do it. He had his money. He'd done what he wanted to do in Oxford, which was make a lot of connections, which he later used. Well, forget it. That's as far. When I found out he didn't take his exams, that was it. Don't tell me, well, maybe that's not the real reason you voted against Clinton. That was the reason I acted on. Did I think he was otherwise a better candidate? Probably so, but I didn't give a damn. You don't take schools, you don't get my vote. Yes.
Is that always the way that it is in every rational decision, though? Because I guess maybe it's just my experience, but I can't reflect on every decision I've ever made and say, I know what reason.
Yeah, often you don't know why you did it, you just did it. And often, you see, it often happens to me that in conversations, I say things I never planned on saying. I didn't, right? I mean, people who do this, you always think, now he said this, so I'm going to say that. There's a technical name for them. They're called bores. It's very boring for the guy who always thinks, what should I say now? And most of us just talk spontaneously. But there are forms of rational behavior that involve what I call recognitional rationality, where you don't have to do a whole lot of reasons from your various desires. The truck is coming down on me, bearing down on me, and I don't think, now if I get out of the way, I will avoid being hit, and if I don't get out of the way, I'll be hit. And on balance, it's better to avoid being hit, because if I do get hit, there'll be all kinds of consequences. I don't do that. I just jump out of the way. That's what I call recognitional rationality, and that's important because that avoids an infinite regress. We'll get to those when we talk about the actual structure of rationality. So there are all kinds of things you do that are not the result of processes of deliberation. And then there are, as we've seen, things you do that are not the result of processes of rational deliberation, where you really do act on your beliefs and desires, but those are pathological. Those are cases of weakness of will or compulsion. And sometimes you deliberate and make up your mind, and then you don't do the thing you thought was the best thing to do. That's the example of drinking the extra Chardonnay from last time. Remember, I gave that example, how you decide you don't want to drink too much, but all the same you find you do drink more than you should. Now, standard models of decision-making rationality make that impossible. I want to say not only is it possible, it happens all the time. So we ought to have a conception of rationality that shows how it's possible. And I forget about the philosophical tradition and ask yourself, what actually happened when I watched television long after I thought I should be watching television, when I really thought I should be doing my homework? And I think we, as philosophers, we ought to be able to answer that question without looking over our shoulder at what Aristotle would have said. Just think about what it's like in your own case. And so I want to answer that as well. Okay, well, some of these questions I might answer right now. In the case of how is it possible that an explanation can explain if it does not give a deterministic explanation, I think the logical form is different. The actual logical form of the explanation is different. The form of the explanation where I say this object fell because it was acted on by gravity, that explanation is deterministic in the very form of the explanation, because what it says is that the causes operating on it were sufficient to determine that it would fall. And indeed, the force of the logical sufficiency there is given by the fact that you can actually logically deduce that it's going to fall, given a description of the initial conditions, together with a statement of the law of gravity, together with a statement of the gravitational forces acting on it. And that is, the claim of sufficiency is cashed out by saying that a full statement of the causes will be sufficient to entail, they will logically imply that that event was going to occur. So you get a logically sufficient, you get a causally set of sufficient conditions, because the statement of the conditions will give you a set of premises which are logically sufficient to entail that the event is going to happen. This you can actually derive that this is going to happen. Now, a lot of people have said, yes, but that's not an oddball case. That's the model for all explanations. And as I mentioned to you briefly, this is the deductive nomological model of explanation. You describe the initial conditions, you give a statement of the law, and you deduce. And it's called deductive nomological because you can actually deduce what's going to happen. And it's nomological. Nomological just means law-like. You can deduce from the statement of the law, together with the description of the initial conditions, the deduction will entail that that event is going to happen. Now, that doesn't happen when we give ordinary descriptions of human behavior. I voted for Clinton. I voted for Obama because I thought he'd have a better domestic policy than McCain. It isn't like that. It's a different logical form. Well, then, how do we answer the skepticism that says, unless it's like that, you didn't really explain it? You didn't explain it because you didn't say why you had to vote for Obama, why that occurred as opposed to something else occurring that might have occurred. And I'm now going to give you the answer to that question. There must be an answer to it because I know in my own case that that explains my behavior. I know that's why I did it. And if somebody comes in a deductive nomological way and they say, look, Searle, we've done a study, and it turns out that middle-class university professors of your socioeconomic status with your education are overwhelmingly likely to vote for the Democratic candidate in an election like that. We have a law with nearly 100% probability that that's how you're going to vote. So we can deduce. It's a deductive nomological explanation. So that's why you voted for Obama, because you instantiate the middle-class professor law of voting behavior. And I want to say, well, there may be such a law, but that's not why I voted. That's not why I voted the way I did. The statistics you have about people with my kind of background and my sort of education and my sort of economic, socioeconomic status and my income tax bracket, all the factors you want, that doesn't give you the reason that I voted. That gives you correlations, and they might be kind of interesting. But the actual reason that functioned in my voting was not the fact that I tend to wear dark gray flannel trousers and that the overwhelming majority of people who wear pants like that vote Democratic. Let's suppose there is such a generalization. That's not why I voted. It doesn't matter what pants I had on. They could be red polka dots, all the same. I can tell you the reason that I voted for Obama, and this is not the right model. What is the right model? Well, it's an intentionalistic explanation, but now we have to meet the challenge. The challenge is, how can it explain if it's not deductive nomological, if it doesn't explain why what had to occur? And to answer that question, we have to make a very serious philosophical claim. And the claim is this: the explanation of individual human behavior, where I rationally decide on the basis of my reasons that I'm going to vote for Obama, and then I act in the gap, I act on those reasons. Those only make sense. You can only fully understand those if you introduce a factor that's simply not present in any of these discussions, and that is the notion of the self. Now, in our philosophical tradition, we have a long series of discussions of the self, and generally the notion of the self is regarded as something of a scandal among philosophers who have our sort of background. Specifically, Hume is supposed to have refuted the idea that in addition to all of our particular experiences, there is an experience, an extra type called the experience of the self. Hume says there are these metaphysical philosophers, he had Descartes in mind, who think they're always aware of the self, but says Hume, when I turn my attention inward and I think as hard as I can about what I experience, do I experience the self? No, I experience some hand gripping my forehead. And I experience a slight headache left over from, what was it, Cabernet Sauvignon last night. And I experience the sound of my voice in my throat, but there's no self, says Hume. Now, he looks as if, well, maybe these metaphysicians, maybe they're got more acute sensitivity than mine. Maybe they can experience the self, but he's being ironic, as usual. He means there's nothing that could count as the experience of the self. Because suppose somebody said, well, actually, I do experience the self. The self is a yellow spot in the upper left-hand corner of my visual field, and I can see it even with my eyes closed. There's a big yellow spot there. That's not a self. That's just a yellow spot. So when Hume says you don't experience the self, he means nothing could count as the experience of the self. Okay, but I want to say and I agree with that. I think that we do not experience the self as an additional entity in our psychological field. There are some questions that sound better in French or German. This one sounds better in German. Was ist das Ich? What is the I? I mean, when I try to turn my attention inward and experience the self, what is the self that I experience? And Hume says, nothing. You cannot experience the self. It's an illusion that you have, that you are the same person from moment to moment, that you're the same self. It's an illusion based on the fact that the experiences you do have resemble each other. There's a sort of smooth passage, says Hume, of resembling experiences. Okay, I want to agree with that, but all the same, I want to say we have to postulate the self. Why? Because we know the following. I have considerations on which I make my decision. Those are called reasons for action. And I consciously consider those reasons, and on the basis of reflection on those reasons, I make up my mind and form a prior intention. And on the basis of that prior intention, I then initiate an intention in action where I try to do something, and then I actually try to do the thing that I'm trying to do. And then on the basis of that, I can then, watch this vocabulary, I can then be held responsible for what I did. Now notice that story that I told you only makes sense if you suppose that there is an X such that X is conscious. You have consciousness X and deliberation X. And this is deliberation means acting on reasons. And decide X and act on decision X and responsible X. That is to say, the story that I told you only makes sense given the assumption that there is a single formal entity that satisfies all of those conditions. It is consciousness capable of deliberating on reasons, capable of making up its mind and deciding on the basis of reasons, capable of acting on its decision, on its prior intention, and capable of accepting responsibility. Now notice the X there is specified purely formally. We don't tell you what it's like to have the X. There's no special feeling that goes with the X. The way I like to think of it is this. You cannot make sense of your perception unless you suppose that there is a point of view from which you perceive. You can't make sense of looking around this room now and perceiving things unless you suppose there's a point of view from which you perceive. But you never see the point of view. You never perceive the point of view. It's just you cannot make sense of your experiences when you experience this great rainbow of possibilities. You can't make sense of those experiences unless you suppose that there's a point of view at which you're at, and it's from that point of view that you have these perceptual experiences. Now, similarly, I want to say you cannot make sense of your decision-making and conscious reasoning and acting unless you suppose that there is a self, a point of view from which all of these occur. But that's a purely formal notion. We're not answering Hume on his own grounds. We're not saying, oh, well, I do experience a self. An important philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe used to have a trick that she would pull in debates. She had an eye defect, And the result of this was that she saw a continuous yellow blotch. So when we look at this wall, we just see a wall. Elizabeth would see a great big yellow blotch wherever she looked. And this was useful to her in all kinds of philosophical debates because nobody had an answer to it. Now, if somebody said, well, she had a self, the yellow blotch, the answer is no. That wouldn't be a self. It would be exactly what you said, a yellow blotch in her visual field, and that's not a self. But the fact is, we do need to postulate the self in order to account for a concatenation of phenomena that we know are real, thinking, deciding, acting. We know are real, and furthermore, we know independently that some of the answers that we give to the questions, why do you do that, are valid answers because we know without observation what our reasons for acting are and on which reasons we are acting. And if somebody might convince us, well, you were guilty of self-deception or you were suffering from memory loss, there might be some pathology. But leaving out such epistemic considerations, there's no doubt that I have these reasons for acting. There's no doubt that I act on some of them, not on others, that I act on the presupposition of free will, though, of course, that doesn't show we have free will. We have to examine that. And that I can only make sense of that whole pattern if I suppose that there is an entity such that it has all these features. Jennifer.
Other than a logical construct, the X, does it have actual function or operation?
Yeah, it does. It does all these things. It's conscious. What? It's
that can control which deliberation,
how the deliberation goes, and all that. And it's fascinating to see. To ask yourself, how the hell does it work in the brain? And there are guys, as we stand here, working on this very question. And in particular, there's a guy who is sort of a fan of this way of thinking named Feinberg in Columbia. What's his first name? Isn't it Todd? Or what's it?
Isn't it Joel?
I thought it was Todd. Todd Feinberg.
There is Todd Feinberg.
Well, anyway, there's a guy at Columbia who does research on the neurobiology of the self. And in fact, he produced a huge, I thought rather boring book in which there's an article by me in which I say all this kind of crap. So there is a whole lot of neurobiology about precisely this issue. And if I'm right, there has to be a neurobiological story to be told, not the naive story. It's not the Cartesian story that says, aha, here's the brain, and you are here. That's not the story that I have in mind. But rather, the story is going to be that there are a set of mechanisms for coordinating your conscious processes which are such that a single entity can have all of those properties. Yes?
Might you say that another logical reason why the self must exist is that the fact that the reasons for an action aren't causally sufficient
Yes.
means that those reasons must be lacking some element that is unique to each
Yeah.
agent in order to complete the reason and make it.
Well, something like this. The reasons are not enough. You got to act on the reasons. See, there's a guy who has all the reasons. Yes. Do you have reasons for doing your homework? Yes, I do have reasons for doing my homework. Any reason for not doing your homework? No, no reason for not doing your homework. Are you free to do your homework? Yes. You have time to do your homework? Yes. So you're not doing your homework? Right, I'm not. That's the guy who has all the reasons. He's aware of the reasons, but he doesn't do anything. Now, I want to say, if you have a theory of human behavior that makes such a guy impossible, you've never been a professor and thought about your students. Or for that matter, you've probably never been a student confronted with this, because this kind of thing happens all the time. Yeah, say some more. Well, maybe we'll come back to you. Yeah.
Seems like he has reasons for not doing his homework, the reason that he doesn't want to.
Yeah, okay. But now this is the weakness of will problem, and we're going to come back to that one as well. Yeah, I have a reason for not doing my homework. It's homework. Is that a compelling reason for not doing your homework? No, it's not a compelling reason. The guy who suffers from weakness of will always has a reason for not doing the thing that he knows that he has a reason to do, but that reason is not sufficient to warrant his not acting on the reason that he knows is the valid reason for doing the thing he knows he ought to do. I hope that made sense, that last sentence. Yes?
Well, I mean, I guess we had this conversation yesterday, but...
Did we?
You know, well,
yesterday was Wednesday.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we may have had different academic experiences, but that sounds like a very compelling reason at the time that you don't want to do your homework.
Yeah.
That, in fact, I don't see any way in which you could claim that he wants to do his homework, or that his desire not to do his homework wasn't more important to him at the time. It seems like a very simple.
Okay, well, this is the picture, and there are cases like that where it's true that I had a desire to do my homework, but I had a stronger desire not to do my homework, and one out. The other one just won out. And that would make it all deterministic. Now, there are cases like that where you act in the grip of an emotion which overcomes your rational processes. This once happened to me. I'm reluctant to tell you this story because it gives you the wrong impression, but it's what I think about when I think about this. I am not patient in restaurants. I tend to get impatient. And I don't know if you've ever been to Austria, but the Austrians ought to have a national slogan, Kollege kommt gleich. That means the guy who's supposed to serve you, he'll come later on. He's coming right away. And once I was in a restaurant outside of Vienna, and we ordered our Wiener Schnitzel, and we waited for what seemed like an hour, and a whole busload of people arrived, a whole damn busload. And they sat down and ordered, and then they brought their food to the busload before they brought us. An hour had passed, and we're still waiting for our food. And I, as they say, lost my temper. I became extremely cross. And I don't know how to describe it quite, but I found myself getting up and going into the kitchen and explaining to those people what I thought of them, their restaurant, their mother, their country, and various other things. And people who heard me were amazed at how much German I could speak. Truth to tell, I was amazed at how much German I could speak. And the point is, I did not have this characteristic experience that you have where you sense, well, I'm doing this, but I could be doing something else. I was truly in the grip. I'm not recommending this. I'm not proud of this, but it's a good example. It illustrates what it's like to be in the grip of an emotion where you, as they say, lose it, where you're cross to the point where you lose your temper. German countries are a good place for this to happen because Germans tend to respect authority. I mean, counting. Ostmark here is part of Germany. I'm counting, that was Hitler's word for Austria, was Ostmark. I'm counting Austria as a part of the German culture here. And the idea was that if you exercise authority, people think you must be justified. You must have the authority. So I didn't get in any trouble from this, but it's not a moment I'm proud of because it was a case where rationality was not operative. I didn't think, on balance, this is what I really should be doing now. I really should be lecturing these people on their moral, culinary, and restaurant inadequacies. No, I should be sitting patiently and waiting. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Vanessa's first. Yeah.
Okay, but the point is that you don't have to deny that you acted on wanting to not do the homework instead. Those things all are just fine. It's just about the explanatory order of the things.
The point.
So you say that you act on a reason and you make it effective by acting on it. That doesn't mean that you're not still entitled to say, one day I didn't want to do it.
Yes, no, that's all right. But I took it, the point of the question was, don't you always act on the strongest desire, which is such that the desire was overwhelming. You couldn't really help yourself. Now, I want to say there's a sense in which I'm going to have to explain in which every voluntary action is an expression of a desire to perform that action. So there's a trivial sense when you always act on your strongest desire, because that's by definition the one you're acting on. The question is, how can you have desire-independent reasons for acting that are effective, that you can act on? And I haven't answered that. We're at one question at a time. The question we're answering today, or at least so far today, is how can it be the case that non-deterministic explanations are valid if they don't tell you why you did something as opposed to something else that you could have done, all other causes remaining the same? And the answer to that question is, one, you know those explanations are valid because you know without observation why you acted, and two, they have a different logical form. The logical form requires the postulation of a self that meets these conditions. Now, that doesn't mean it's valid. It might turn out that the whole thing is a massive illusion, that we're all in the grip of a determinism that we're unaware of. But at any rate, I'm describing the logical form of our explanations of rational human behavior, and I'm saying the logical form is not this. It's not the DN. It's not the deductive nomological form. It is the form of a rational agent, a rational self, making a decision in the gap. That is to say, when you act on the presupposition that the causes acting on you do not set causally sufficient conditions. However, that's a separate question I haven't answered, and that is, granted that every action you perform is the expression of a desire to perform that action then and there, how can it be the case that there can be desire-independent reasons for action that are causally effective? And once again, as in our earlier discussion, we know it happens. We know it happens that you have a reason for doing something that's independent of your inclination, independent of your desires, and all the same, you succeed in acting on that reason. How is that possible? Even though you have other desires that conflict with that reason. Yeah?
So when you say that that independent element that allows you to act independent of your desires and beliefs is the will.
Yeah.
But
No,
then
what?
when you say that someone, for example, when they don't do the homework, it's because they have a weaker will, then the reason why one would feel to do the homework is because there's the consequences. So then could you argue that the will is imposed, that your will, so to speak, is imposed on you by others?
Yeah.
It's not really your own will.
Well, okay. Now, I'm not sure I understand the question, but what I hear you saying is something like the following. In the cases where you acted on the reason that wasn't the one you thought was the best reason, in the case where you had weakness of will, then it's because the will was such that other people could impose their will on you. Was that? Because there are cases like that, but that's not the cases we've been considering. They're not the cases where there's some outside will. I try to avoid using the word will here because it's got a sordid history, as does the self. Now, the self I'm forced to use. The only time I use will is when I use this technical notion of weakness of will, which I can define without postulating the will as a separate entity. However, we do say of people that they are strong-willed or weak-willed, and we ought to be able to give an explanation of that. We ought to be able to justify that. But on the account that I'm giving, I owe you an answer to the question, how is weakness of will possible, and how is it possible that we can act on reasons where the reason is recognized as a valid reason, but is totally independent of our desires, totally independent of our inclinations? How can that be the case if every action is the expression of a desire to do that action? Now, there are a whole bunch of questions. One of them I've answered this morning. The one I've answered so far is, how can it be the case that the reason you give explains if it's not deterministic? How can it explain if it's not deterministic? And the answer is the explanation has a different logical structure. The explanation of the logical structure of the explanation is not, this happened because it's an instance of a law, of a causal law with such causally sufficient conditions. Rather, it's a conscious agent performed this action while acting in the gap by making a certain reason effective by acting on that reason. And that you can only make sense of that. I mean, it's a transcendental argument in Kant's sense. Given that these explanations are okay, what must be the case if they are to be okay? And the answer is you can only make sense of them if you postulate a self. Okay, let's go on. Other questions so far. We've actually covered quite a lot of ground. I didn't intend to do that part this morning, but let's keep going. We've only, so far, really considered the first of our 6 propositions that beliefs and desires are causally sufficient for action. And I've said, as far as our experiences are concerned, that's false. As far as our experiences are concerned, the typical rational action, you do have beliefs and desires, but they're not causally sufficient. Now, the second one that I want to consider is that rationality requires rules. That whenever you act rationally, it's because you're following the rules of rationality. And I want to say, in general, that's false. There are cases where you follow rules. Try to buy low and sell high. That's what the stockbroker tells you. Or a stitch in time saves 9. Or look before you leap. Or the kind of stuff you get in Chinese fortune cookies. I guess those are rules. But the kind of rules that you're supposed to act on, where they're supposed to be rules that guarantee rationality, that seems to me wrong. And a good way to illustrate their wrongness is to appeal to a famous paradox in the history of philosophy called, I already got a lot of stuff on this blackboard. It's called the Lewis-Carroll paradox. And you remember Lewis Carroll is the name of a mathematics don. As a matter of fact, at my old college in Oxford, and his real name was Dodgson. And he was a logician, and he did produce the following paradox. Two people are having a discussion. It turns out it's the hare and the tortoise, but that's not essential to the actual discussion. And here's how it goes. One person presents a form of logical reasoning, and the other one asks, but how can that be justified? How can that force me to draw the conclusion? So the argument goes something like the following. The one says, well, look, if it rained last night, the ground will be wet. It did rain last night, therefore the ground will be wet. And the other one says, okay, I got the premises. I got if it rained last night, the ground will be wet. And I got it rained last night. But what I don't get, how did you justify that last step? How did you go to, therefore the ground will be wet? Why did you do that? Because what you gave me was, you said, if it rained last night, the ground will be wet, if P then Q. And then you had P, and that was it rained last night. And then, given all that stuff, what entitled you to write down Q? And the first guy says, well, don't you see, I had the rule of modus ponens. Oh, really? And how does that work? Well, that's the rule that says whenever you've got premises of the form if P, then Q, and P, then that whole thing will enable you to infer Q. Write that down. Write that down. It says, I don't know who's doing the tortoise, I guess. The tortoise says, write that down. So Achilles foolishly writes it down. Well, if P, then Q, and P, therefore Q. And then says the tortoise, all right, now I got this, you got this. If P, then Q, and P, therefore then Q. And you got if P, then Q, and you got P. But what I don't see is how, given all this crap here, you're entitled to write down that. What justifies you in writing down that? Well, now, Achilles is a professor of philosophy, and he's immensely patient, unlike some professors you will encounter. And he says, well, don't you see? It's very simple. Whenever you've got if P, then Q, and P, and that entitles you write down Q. He might even say this has a name. It's called Modus Ponens. And you've got this stuff, if P, then Q, and P. Whenever you've got all of that, that is, you got all of this, you can write down Q, okay? Because once you see that you've got modus ponens together with the premises, that whole thing entitles you to write down Q. Well, you know what what the tortoise is going to say? He's going to say, I understand all the crap on this left-hand side, but I don't see how this now is, we got to add that to all that other stuff. I don't see how all that other stuff entitles me to infer Q. And then you can see you've got an infinite regress. It's going to keep on going. Okay, that's the Lewis-Carroll paradox, that if you try to justify the inference by appealing to a rule, you get an infinite regress. Now, there's a standard textbook answer, and the textbook answer is you shouldn't treat the rule of modus ponens as if it were a separate premise. That's the standard textbook answer. But I want to say that doesn't answer the objection. Suppose that Achilles had said, oh, by the way, this is a rule. All the same, the tortoise could have said, fine, write down the rule and write down all that other stuff. How are you justified in writing that down? Saying that the rule is not a premise but a rule, that doesn't help, because you've still got the infinite regress run going, because you have to ask then, yes, and what's the rule for applying the rule? And then that rule I wrote over here, and then it looks like you're going to still have the infinite regress. What's the correct answer? The correct answer, I don't know why this is not generally recognized, but here it is. If you hear the argument, if it rained last night, the ground will be wet. It rained last night, therefore the ground will be wet. What makes that valid? It's just plain valid as it stands. The meanings of the words are sufficient to guarantee the validity. The mistake is to think it gets its validity from the rule of modus ponens. I would want to say the other way around. The rule of modus ponens gets its validity from the fact that it states a pattern of an infinite number of independently valid arguments. The mistake behind the Lewis-Carroll paradox was not to treat the rule as a separate premise. The mistake was to think the rule plays any role at all. The rule does not function in the validity of the inference. The inference I gave you in ordinary English, if it rained last night, the ground will be wet. It rained last night, so the ground will be wet. That's it. That's the whole story, and you don't need any more. If you add the rule, that might be because, well, you'd like a pattern. You'd like to see what pattern that valid argument exemplified, and you can do that, but the validity does not derive from exemplifying the pattern. It derives from the fact that the argument is valid as it stands. There was a period in philosophy when people were worried by inferences like, well, look, if it's red, it's colored. It is red, therefore it's colored. But now, what were the definitions supposed to be of red and colored? You know, it's not like man is a rational animal. So they had worries about this. But I want to say that proposition is analytic as it stands. If it's red, it's colored. You don't need some extra rule, some universally quantified thing. All red things are colored things. You don't need that. That's already implicit in the meaning of the word red. Now, similarly, the validity of the argument, if it rained last night, the ground will be wet. It rained last night, therefore the ground will be wet. The validity is already present. You don't need any rule. It's a mistake to think that in addition to the meanings, you have a rule. Now, in a way, our very sophistication is an obstacle to understanding this because, of course, proof theoretically, if you just treat this as syntactical objects, if you treat that, I intended the stuff I wrote as actually shorthand for meaningful English sentences. This one goes, if it rained last night, then the ground will be wet. It rained last night, therefore the ground will be wet. The P's and Q's are just shorthands. But if you're programming a computer, you might program it with this rule. Whenever you see symbols of that shape and you see a symbol of that shape, then print out a symbol of that shape. That's a proof theoretical or syntactical rule. The proof theory is significant because it says when you got these syntactical objects, you can perform such and such operation on them. And that's an important development in intellectual history because of a very important property that was discovered in the 1930s, and that is, roughly speaking, if you map the semantics onto the syntax right, you can forget about the semantics and just do the syntax, and it will grind out the right semantics at the end. So if you put the right meanings to these in at the beginning, then you'll get the right meanings out at the end, and the processes pure in between can be purely syntactical. Map the semantics onto the syntax right at the beginning, and then perform purely syntactical operations. The rule that you gave your computer, when you scan that, print out that, that's a substantive rule. But that's not the rule of modus ponens construed as a logical principle. That is a syntactical rule for performing operations on syntactical entities. So our very sophistication from proof theory, where we think, well, we have rules of proof, and the rules of proof says whenever you got that and that, you can print out that. That's okay. I got no objection to that, and that is an important development in intellectual life, because it made roughly speaking, it made computers possible. It made it possible for us to program computers that are effective, because the computer is purely syntactical. It operates on syntactical elements. It takes syntactical elements at the beginning and it prints out a syntax at the end. And in between, all of the processes are purely syntactical. It works because if you get the rules right and you got the right mapping of the syntax onto the semantics at the beginning, you'll get the right semantics out at the end. There are a couple of exceptions, a famous exception to that. Gödel's theorem is a famous exception, and there are, but with oddball exceptions like that, you don't have to worry about the semantics when you're actually carrying out the derivations. Okay, let me just summarize what I said. In actual logical reasoning, like the one I just gave you, if it rained last night, the ground will be wet. It did rain last night, so the ground will be wet. A rule of modus ponens plays no role at all. It's a mistake to think the inference derives its validity from the rule. The inference doesn't derive its validity from anything because it doesn't need to. It's valid as it stands. The meanings of the words, the semantic content of the premises, is sufficient to guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The truth of the premises is sufficient to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. When you do a proof theoretical analog of the semantical derivation, then you can do rules that just operate on meaningless symbols. The rules just take this set of marks and that set of marks and say print out that. That is a substantive principle, and that's what makes it possible. That's what makes computers so powerful. They don't have to worry about what any of this stuff means. They just manipulate the symbols, and we have very powerful methods now for manipulating the symbols in such a way that if you got the right input, you'll get, and you follow the, and the machine doesn't break down, you follow the rules correctly, you'll get the right output. You can forget about the semantics. But in ordinary reasoning, the ordinary reasoning does not derive its validity from the rule. It derives its validity from the propositional contents being expressed in the premises and the conclusion. And the validity derives from the fact that the premises are sufficient to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Okay, so the conclusion that I draw from this is it's a mistake to look for rules of reasoning, because if the reasoning is actually valid, then the rules play no role. The reasoning has to be valid on its own. Let's take questions about that. Yeah?
What's the stop us from saying something like, if Zeus was angry and that's why it rained last night?
Yeah. Well, naturally you want to know, and what is it about Zeus's anger that produces the rain? Now notice, I think this type of explanation is probably the most primitive kind, where you take all natural phenomena as forms of intentionality. The gods are angry, so they threw all that water at us. It is an immensely sophisticated advance to be able to reason deductive nomologically, to be able to reason on the basis of principles that have no intentionality whatever. And as I've said at various times, I think the idea of a scientific law was immensely important in human intellectual history, and we're still living through the era of the law. And I don't really know how far back it goes, but it really got going in the 17th century. And there was a model that grew among intellectuals in the 17th century that said, if you knew all the laws, and you knew all of the distribution of the particles at any given instant, you could predict and retrodict the entire future and past of the universe. This is Laplace's demon. Laplace was a French mathematician and statistician, and he said, look, imagine that there is a demon who stands outside the universe, but this demon knows all of the laws governing the behavior of the particles. Then if the demon knows the physical position of the particles at any instant, he can predict the entire future of the universe, and he can retrodict the entire past of the universe. And that's the model of explanation. That was the model of explanation that drove people, and still to this day drives a lot of people, is the idea that if you just had the laws, then the universe is like a big clock. It's a clock universe, and you can predict exactly where the hands are going to be an hour from now because you know their position now. Now, the point you're saying is, well, there are lots of explanations that we give that don't meet this pattern. Those are intentionalistic explanations. Now, here is an important part of intellectual history. The immense success of the deductive model, deductive nomological model in the sciences has given us the impression that all genuine explanation ought to be like that. And the explanation of human behavior, if it really is possible to have a science of human behavior, would have to be deductive nomological. That's Hempel's picture. Hempel's picture is that if we look closely at the explanation of human behavior that we actually accept, we will see that they are deductive nomological explanations in disguise. And he gives the example. Why did the Dust Bowl farmers in Oklahoma move to California? And he said, well, there is a general law. It's kind of hard to state it, and it's sort of vague, and it seems to allow for exceptions, but that's because where society is concerned, the phenomena are complicated. And the idea is there is a general law that if people are dissatisfied with the conditions of their life in one place and they see better opportunities in another place, they will move from the first place to the second place. They'll move from Oklahoma to California. I'm embarrassed to say this because I think it's such a bad piece. I admired Hempel enormously, but I think it's a bad piece of philosophy, this. But in any case, that's the picture that he had. The picture that he has is that ordinary explanations like Dust Bowl farmers moved to California because they thought there'd be better life in California. If we really look closely at that, we'll see that it's really Laplace's demon in action. It really is there. Really is a law there. It's just we have a hard time stating it, and it seems to allow for exceptions. Yes, Vanessa.
So your answer to the question about Zeus is that that sort of doesn't compute as an issue of validity, but if we chose to find that explanatory, that'd be perfectly fine.
Yeah, here's the point. Suppose that Zeus really existed and really was up there on Mount Olympus and deciding, what the hell, those people in California, they've had enough sunshine and I'm angry at them, here comes rain. Then that would be an intentionalistic explanation like any other. And what I'm saying is the logical form of the intentionalistic explanation is not a deductive nomological explanation in disguise. It has a different logical structure altogether because it's not deterministic in form. Because the explanation I gave you does not imply, well, you mean Zeus couldn't have done it any differently? Yeah, he could have. He's a god after all. He can do any goddamn thing. Well, I won't say that. He can do anything he likes. Okay. But that's different from this explanation. Why did this object fall? It couldn't help itself. The explanation of why this object fell is deterministic in form. By that I mean if you wrote it out as a set of propositions, you would see the premises imply the conclusion. It is deductive. Whereas Zeus made it rain because he was angry at us, that's not deductive in form. Yes?
So when you're talking about deterministic as in conflict with freedom,
yeah,
are you sure you've really gotten away from that kind of explanation? Because it seems like you've removed Zeus and maybe even removed the anger, but you haven't removed the decision if you're still calling it determined. I mean, that's no more innocent than calling it governed.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but so what I'll do is what I usually do, answer it, and then you tell me how I missed the point. The answer that I would give to the question as I understood it is this. There are two separate questions. One is, are the questions, intentionalistic questions, deterministic in form? And the answer to that question is no. But the second question is, yes, but are they deterministic in fact? Because it might well be the case that though the logical form wasn't deductive, the premises didn't entail, the explanans did not entail the explanandum all the same. The desires and beliefs were sufficient to determine that that's what's going to happen. So there are two different questions. The point I'm answering now is you're not forced to determinism by the fact that you accept certain explanations. But that doesn't mean determinism is false. It just means that you're not committed to determinism when you say such things as, I voted for Obama because I thought he'd be better for the economy. I mean, this is a true statement. I did vote for Obama because I thought he'd be better for the economy. And I didn't think that it would make any difference to foreign policy, and it didn't. He has effectively Bush's policy in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's better PR than Bush did, but Bush at the end didn't give a damn about PR. So I didn't get what I wanted in foreign policy, but I did get economic policies that I think are better than we would have had under McCain. Now that's a valid explanation, and it's not deterministic in form. But your question, I take it, is yes, but it might be deterministic in fact, because your beliefs and desires might have been sufficient to determine that you would vote that way.
Well,
Is that, have another try.
That was part of it, but I guess it seems like if you're saying that it is deterministic as somehow in conflict with the notion that I was doing it freely.
Yeah, we're going to discuss this when we talk about free will. There is a standard answer to the free will question. And like most of the views I'm attacking are in David Hume, if you read it carefully. And this is certainly in Hume. I'm the greatest philosopher in the English language that ever lived, but that's why he's worth arguing with. And Hume says, look, of course you acted freely, but all the same, your behavior was completely determined. Because determinism is not opposed to free will. Determinism is opposed to things like being forced or compelled. So, did you act freely when you voted for Obama? Yes, nobody held a gun at my head. I was not in the grip of a spastic movement of my arm so that I couldn't help it when it made the X on the ballot paper. It's just a reflex. It wasn't something I was forced or compelled to do, so I acted freely. But of course, all the same, I could not have done otherwise because the forces were causally sufficient. So are all actions determined? Yes, everything is determined. Are some actions free? Yes, some actions are free because they're determined by things like your beliefs and your desires. Okay, now this I regard as one of the great cop-outs in the history of Western philosophy, and believe me, it's got a lot of competitors as a magnificent cop-out. But this is a tremendous cop-out. I don't think this solves the problem of free will at all, but I have to tell you it's what most philosophers today believe. Many of my colleagues, I don't know if they still do, but Donald Davidson certainly believed this. He actually wrote about this. So it's widespread, and if I had to say what is the most common view among American philosophers today, I'd have to say, this view, by the way, has got a name. It's called Compatibilism. And Compatibilism says determinism and free will are compatible because though all actions are determined, some are done of your own free will. And to say they're done of your own free will is just to say they're determined by certain internal causes like your beliefs and desires. I almost gag when I tell you this, but anyway, that's the prevailing view. And I'm sure that if we probably did a check of the journals, we'd find most philosophers today are compatibilists. I'm sorry about that, but I've done the best I can. I'm still arguing with them. But anyway, we'll come back to compatibilism when we talk about free will. Okay, so we've knocked out two of our famous premises. Our famous principles of the classical model of rationality. One is that all actions are caused by all rational actions are caused by beliefs and desires, where cause there means causally sufficient. The beliefs and desires are causally sufficient. And I've said, not that I can prove that that's false, but that is not the characteristic of rational actions. The characteristic of rational actions is that you act on your beliefs and desires. They give you reasons for acting, but they're typically not deterministic because you have a sense of the gap. Now, to repeat, I haven't proven that free will is right. In fact, if somebody put a gun at my head and said, choose between free will and determinism, God, that would be a tough one. I think probably determinism has a greater chance of being right, but we can't believe it. Literally, we cannot believe it. And it's not like you can't escape the illusion of color. Even if I become convinced that color is an illusion, still, her shirt sure looks blue to me. But I can then lead my life on the assumption that it's not really blue, that's just an illusion. But I cannot lead my life on the assumption that determinism is true. In about 3 hours, I'm going to go into one of these great Berkeley restaurants, and they're going to give me the menu. Now, one of the things I cannot say is, I am a determinist. Everything that's going to happen is going to happen. Che sarà, sarà. It's an Italian restaurant. So I'll just wait and see what happens. I'll wait and see what I order. I can't say that because the refusal to exercise free choice is only intelligible to me as an exercise of free choice. You cannot escape the presupposition of freedom in a way that you can escape the presupposition that colors are real. Yes?
I'm not sure if I just missed this, but you said that intentional reasons for intentional explanations have different logical forms.
Yes.
Can you explicitly say their logical form?
Can I what?
Can you make explicit?
Yeah, the logical form is this. The form of the intentional explanation in which let's say, I voted for Obama because I thought he would be better for domestic economic policy. The logical form of that is a rational self acting in the gap on the basis of consideration of reasons made one reason effective by intentionally acting on that reason. That's the logical form. But now that only makes sense given the presupposition of a self, that there's a single entity that has all these features. That is the logical form. Whereas the logical form of this is there are a set of causes operating which are such that given that those causes operate, nothing else could have happened. And consequently, from the statement of the causes, you can deduce the occurrence of the event which is to be explained. Okay, how are we doing? I was going to get all through 6 of these today, and I only got up to number 2. What's number 3? Number 3 is a lot of fun, that rationality is a separate faculty. But maybe if we've only got 5 minutes, let's say we already got onto acrasia. Let's consider the case of acrasia, because we've said a lot about it already. Maybe we could finish talking about it. What actually happens? Now forget about the history of philosophy and what everybody says about this, and just think what it's like when you find something appealing and you act on the thing that you find appealing rather than on the thing that you know you ought to be doing. You find it appealing to watch television rather than doing your homework, even though if you were asked to reflect, you would say, the best thing to do would be doing my homework. Now, we agreed last time that that's irrational. It is irrational of you intentionally, knowingly, voluntarily to do something that you know is the lesser good, to do something you know is not the best thing to do. What's going on there? And I think the short answer is something like this. There are different parts to the self. The self is not a single unified entity, and there are all sorts of conflicting reasons operating in the self, and the self may make one of these reasons effective by acting on it while not thinking that that's the best reason. So tonight it might happen to you that you will watch a playoff game instead of doing your homework. There is a playoff game tonight, and even though you might think, well, this would be a good night for doing my homework, it's not at all unlikely that you might find yourself, if there are extra innings quite late at night, worried about various pitchers that you don't really give a damn about in real life, but there they are, and you're interested in how it's going to work out. This is the kind of thing that actually happens. How can it happen? The answer is that you shouldn't think of decision-making as like a vector of forces, where the one that you think is the strongest reason will triumph over all the other reasons. Rather, you should think of the self as a field in which various forces can be considered. Even the field is misleading because that suggests something more deterministic than I intend. but as a place where different reasons can be evaluated and considered, and sometimes you will find yourself voluntarily and irrationally acting on a reason which you do not think is the best reason. So somebody says to you, but is this really what you think you ought to be doing? No, it's not what I think I ought to be doing. I ought to be doing something else. But all the same, are you voluntarily doing this? Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm doing the thing that I feel like doing, even though I grant you that it's not the thing that I recognize that I ought to be doing. At the end, I think that's the right story to give. But the question, why does that story seem difficult to us? Why does it seem impossible? And the answer is because we've been brought up on this ideology that says, well, if you really thought that something was the best reason, then that would be the reason you acted on, because everybody from, going back to Aristotle, going back to the Greeks, has said that there's no way that that evil behavior must result from ignorance. You didn't really know what the best thing to do was, because if you knew what the best thing to do was, that's the thing you would do. Okay, I didn't finish this part. We'll go on with this next Tuesday. I want you to read, be sure to keep up with the reading, and be sure to read Gary Becker and all these guys I'm going to be attacking, and Bernard Williams and all these other characters on the reading list.